All right. So let's get started. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, this afternoon, to talk about the security in the novel normal and what's going to be changing. I think this sudden and rapid transition to the virtual work has forced a lot of businesses and organizations to grapple with an unfamiliar operating environment, right? All the security concerns that are coming with a remote workforce. And now we're talking about how do organizations plan for what a return to work is going to look like, right? For many people in the economy, it's going to be a real return to work. But for a lot of us out there, it's really going to be about a return to a workplace because we've been working for the last 8 weeks, working remotely, working in different venues, et cetera. So the question really is, are we going to return to the workplace and how, right? During this period of the acute response, and you should see a graphic on your screen that represents how we at Toffler Associates see the phases of the COVID-19 recovery, right? As we move out of the acute response and into the Great Wait, there are a lot of questions there, right? Will we make the workforce more permanently remote, right? Will that allow organizations to reduce or modify the footprint of traditional office space to accommodate that remote model? Right? But a remote workforce also introduces additional risk. Not only are organizations going to struggle with protecting their information and human assets from targeting by foreign or criminal entities, but remote work is going to introduce some seemingly innocuous risks, right? Because while employees were coming to the workplace, they might have been vetted, they have to badge to get in. We don't know that about people in their own work environment. In a remote work environment, maybe your roommate is a risk. Should we be vetting your roommate, your spouse? What are your children doing? The workplace environment, that computer, that digital endpoint access is now open to a lot of other risks and opportunities. Do home ISPs need to be vetted or approved by companies? What is the duty of care associated with employees working remotely? Do companies during the period of the Great Wait need to start thinking about DSOC coverage or notifications for employees that might be under the threat of natural disaster, local disruptions, or viral hotspots, right? So we're struggling with these questions as we think about the remote workforce. Organizations are going to implement new policies, training processes, and technologies to assist in protecting those assets. We're going to have to redefine defense in depth, the security perimeter, especially as physical, digital, and cognitive, emotional, and psychological realms converge. So today, our panelists are going to reflect on how security has become an integral part of every function across business. Their insights, learnings, and best practices hopefully will prepare leaders in this webinar world for how to manage what will likely be a new and permanent way of operating for almost every company and organization. This novel normal is going to require an expanded approach to security across people, technology, operations, and policies. And this prolonged period of remote work has created new endpoints, human, technical, and facilities that have to be accounted for and secured moving forward. So with that said, before we get started, I want to go through a few technical points. First, we will be recording this webinar, and everyone that is registered is going to receive an email with a link to the recording. Second, if anyone is experiencing technical difficulties, please use the chat button at the bottom of your screen and message our technical support. They should be able to help you work on the cause, figure it out. And if anyone has any questions for our panelists during the webinar, please send them using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we're going to do our best to get to the questions. And thank you in advance, or thank you to all of those who submitted questions when you registered. We were able to use a lot of those questions to shape our panelists' responses and shape this discussion. So we appreciate that very much. With that, let me turn to our experts and introduce our panelists. I sort of a Brady Bunch screen here, but I have down my bottom left is Caitlin Durkovich. Caitlin is a colleague at Toffler Associates. She's a fellow director. She spent 8 years at DHS in the predecessor organization to CISA, including some time as Assistant Secretary of Infrastructure Protection, working with industry and government to mitigate risk and enhance resilience of critical infrastructure. She's got more than 20 years of experience in Homeland Security. She is a board member at InfraGard National Members Alliance. And perhaps since we're all getting a look into our homes, I thought sort of a fun fact is that Caitlin is born and raised in New Mexico, makes the best chili ever, and is a proud Blue Dome. So cross-country experiences for Caitlin. Thank you for joining us. Next, I want to move to Skeet. Skeet has 30 years of experience in information security for private and public organizations, and he's currently the acting chief information security officer for multiple organizations where he's been leading the pandemic response. Skeet is a certified coach in lacrosse, track, and cross country, and his beard has been compared to Steven Spielberg, Ernest Hemingway, and the most interesting man in the world. I will provide an unnamed award to anyone using the chat function to come up with a better comparison for his beard. You can work that out afterwards. And finally, let me turn to Casey. Casey, for more than 20 years, has been focused on technology and security in the electric sector, primarily in nuclear generation and grid operations. He's active in industry groups such as the American Public Power Association, Large Public Power Council, and the Electric Subsector Coordinating Council, including ISACs and various other groups focused on improving security and information sharing. And he is also the National InfraGard Energy Sector Chief. He is in fact a native Cornhusker, and from the expression on his face, you can tell he is, quote, not all that fun because there is work to do and the bad guys never take a break. So with that, KC, let me turn it to you, and let me start this question and open it up with, how do you step out of the fog now, this sort of strategic fog that has enveloped us as we're in the acute response and we're moving into the great wait? How do you start to secure and take steps to secure that novel normal of the future?
That's a good one. I think it's easy to get bogged down in the now. All the response that you're trying to, deal with and respond to and be preventative for as you went to work from home. I think the individuals and teams that can look to the future will best navigate those new norms. And I think people got to really start looking different and thinking different around how do they secure that workforce and the systems in which they operate in. If it will require more than a mild shift, right? This will require a paradigm shift in your brain around how are you going to enable that workforce, and with that, give them the tools to collaborate and meet the capabilities while not sacrificing any of your real risk awareness. Take that time to consider what that future could look like, and I think that the rest of the group will probably highlight that great as we talk today. But I think it's a very important fact to take that time and understand as technologists, how do we get in front of those things to give people the policy and the guide rails that individuals will need to understand, because those boundaries will help give them the freedom to innovate and fail fast and be able to, survive in this new environment as they work remote or change how they work. The most important thing to me is knowing the security and knowing our environment and having the visibility to see that attacker and have the response. And I think response is and will remain very critical. It's going to be very difficult as we continue into this longer term.
Great. Thanks, Casey. Skeet, let me turn to you. As the pandemic incident lead at a number of organizations, what common challenges have you seen in those places, and how would you frame those challenges?
So we've seen a lot of different dimensions that really existed in the traditional world, but we had better controls around. As we've moved out to the remote workforce, we've seen that there's reduced visibility into the action of the users. We don't know exactly what's going on around them, where in a traditional office setting, we actually had at least our controls that we have in place, from an access control physically to cameras to other pieces. We've also seen just simple things that you take for granted: endpoint support, patching, vulnerability analysis, being able to even remote in and control access to a device, all have additional dimensions of security related to those, and being able to push those out in like patches in a timely manner. We've also seen a lot of issues related to an increase in cloud usage. People have started adopting those, which actually has a lot of different dimensions that you have to address, from protecting against shadow IT encroaching, where people start using tools that you're not aware of, to tools that actually may have had vulnerabilities pop up that you weren't aware existed until we actually put them under load. All of those have actually caused us to actually have to address the types of skills and types of priorities that we're all focusing on. And and then I would say we've all had to look at our policies very closely and understand what are the rules we're playing by. What are those guidelines, as Casey mentioned? How do we actually give a clear set of clean rules of the road to all the users now that they're working in a different environment? How do you configure your Wi-Fi? How do you make sure that people aren't accessing your device when you're away from it? And all these things have we've seen it consistently across multiple organizations. So I know everyone's actually experiencing a similar dimension.
So it sounds like I'll turn to you, Caitlin. Casey and Skeet have talked a little bit about that blend of the technology and the human problem. But as you're looking out to the great wait, this sort of 6 to 30-month period of disruption and friction, what are your biggest security concerns in the business world? Like, what do you see as the greatest risks out there that companies and organizations should be thinking about as they move into that transition phase?
Hans, great question. My biggest concern is complacency and lack of healthy paranoia. We're 8 weeks into this now. The pace has been grueling. I think fair to say I'm tired. And as we started remote work, I think everybody had their guard up, was thinking, carefully about what they were doing in the controls around not just their, digital footprint, but also their workspace. And I think the further that we get into this, that some of those practices are gonna start to slip, and people are gonna get lazy about things and do things out of convenience. The novelty of this is worn off. Again, when you're on a Zoom from 8 a.m. till 7 p.m., you're tired and you make mistakes. And the other thing, the healthy paranoia piece goes to the how Casey opened up, which is really at the end of the day, the bad guys never take a break. And our adversaries, and they range from script kiddies and thugs to cyber criminals and vandals and even saboteurs. They don't let a crisis go to waste either. And they know that we're focused on response, that we're operating in an unnormal, and they're very savvy and are looking to take advantage of our vulnerabilities. And I think that we don't often give enough credibility to those adversaries and to those actors. And you opened up in your remarks about, if you're at home with a roommate, you've been living with them for years. Why would you ever think that they would, have malicious intent? Well, the reality is it's the world that we live in today. In the corporate world, you deal with insider threat. Why isn't insider threat an issue from remote work? So lots of things to think about, but I think really at the end of the day, the two things that really worry me most are complacency and that lack of healthy paranoia.
Thank you. So, given what you guys have talked about and the challenges of the human operating system and the issues with technology, I really quickly want to turn to you, Casey. In your earlier comments, not in this webinar, but in some of your writing and your presentations, you've highlighted the importance of preparation. And a lot of folks have been talking about this COVID-19 as a black swan, right? And those of us that have been studying these things know it's not really a black swan. We've always known about the risks of an influenza or a pandemic. But how do you value the preparation aspect for this thing? Preparing for the low probability, high impact issue. How do you make sure that people are prepared, and what's the value of that preparation as you move forward?
I don't know about the audience today, but myself in the electric sector, we do a lot of preparation around this. If you go back to the previous bird flu, we had pandemic plans developed. We have done a lot of things with swine flu in different regions. So you actually had pandemic plans developed, and we respond to those regularly. So like when we went to this work at home, there really wasn't a security posture change for us in any way. The only thing that I really changed was I added an EDR, an endpoint detection and response capability to all the clients, just so we'd have better visibility and remote control to black hole that device in a security posture. But ultimately, I think having that preparation is critical. I think, you know, you talk about it, and it's kind of funny, you know, we talk about all the drills we do and everything else. Like for ourselves, we've had multiple already this year, and they ain't drills. And I think that is really the fact now that you see that training in people, you see that capability for people to think on their own, be able to respond outside of the normal hierarchy of management, and knowing that, hey, you have an assigned role, here's your task, go do it. And I think that incident command structure is a key thing that everybody needs to really understand and be able to respond to, because it doesn't matter if it's, you know, an event like this, or if it's a crisis response to bad news, to a cyber event, to a ransomware. It doesn't matter. You've got to have that in your DNA to be able to survive in the world we live in.
Skeet, you know, again, we talk about the issue of the cyber threat service. So talk to us a little bit about how this particular incident or crisis has really changed or expanded an organization's cyber threat service.
Yeah, so what we saw was an exponential increase in the threat surface. A traditional organization had a subset of users that actually worked in a remote capability or already was actually in the field, but now we've moved to an entire workforce that are completely remote. So each of those endpoints has now become a attack vector. And to some of the conversation we've had already, Casey talking about the EDR, that endpoint detection and response capability, the roommates, all of those are the complicating factors that make that endpoint very vulnerable. And what we've seen is not all organizations had the capability to have that visibility into those devices. They may not have had the logging coming off of it. They may not have had those tied into their security operations center or into their managed detection and response capabilities into their SIM, so that they could actually see the attacks occurring, so that they know when there's an attack coming from one of these vectors. So that's one of the biggest challenges we've seen. And the other that I mentioned before was really that cloud spectrum. You know, the concept that the cloud people take care of your security is a misnomer. You know, it's just someone else's computer, and you're running your data on it, and understanding where your data is, what your critical data is, and how it's flowing is critical. So I think there's a new level of importance on how your teams are able to identify what those threats are and be able to hunt those out and be able to resolve them quickly in this much larger footprint.
So that's a great point. You know, we talk about our understanding. Caitlin, you talked about this need to be vigilant and to have a healthy dose of paranoia. You know, Skeet, you're talking about the importance of understanding where these threats are coming from. You know, I'll put this to really the panel in general. How are we able to communicate and ensure that people understand the real risks associated with a remote work environment? Not just the technology side of the risks, but the people, the process, those intangible sides of that risk as well. And I'll open it up to the group. Is how do we help organizations really get under this issue?
So Hans, I'll start. I think that there is a lot of opportunity to teach from experience. And at Toffler Associates, we've got a way that we think about resilience. And one of those things is kind of continuous learning and education. There are so many examples out there of both ways that remote work is going well, but also ways that remote work is not going well. And we've all told the story of the poor soul who got up to go to the bathroom and forgot to shut the door. But these stories and memes and news articles are an opportunity, on a regular basis to bring your workforce together and to use them as examples and to talk about what you as a company are doing to mitigate those risks, to hear from employees about the challenges that they're having, how they're thinking about it, and what they need to create a more secure environment. I think the other piece of this is really the need to drive home individual resilience, right? In the past, as an employee, I've gone to an office and my IT administrator and IT team have been responsible for making sure there's internet and the electricity's on and kind of all the things that you need. Well, now all of a sudden, I'm responsible for making sure that I've got sufficient bandwidth. And it's challenging when you're in a house with 5 people who are distance learning and working all at the same time. And so we've got to continue to kind of drive home and help employees understand how to do this, because it used to be that they relied on people like Casey, right? So we're going to have to make them more sufficient and give them the tools to ensure that they're resilient.
That's great. Skeet, thoughts on this one?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think became very apparent to us is the traditional security awareness programs, the 1990s CBT model of point and click your way through security awareness are done.
I thought that was like a 2020 model.
Sorry. Probably need to explain CBT to a lot of people. What we've seen is that model, it doesn't really sink in. And, the cyber actors are very, very good at leveraging fear and uncertainty. And we've got plenty out there right now. And they're leveraging that into very targeted, very sophisticated attacks that are taking advantage of that fear and uncertainty, and making sure that our users are not only educated on what the best practices are, but we're staying in front of them and communicating to them what the threats really are and how it impacts them and how they're a part of that machine that needs to be protecting the assets that are under protection. It's a changing dynamic that we need to stay in front of. And to Caitlin's point, the healthy paranoia, building that out there in the users so they understand and they think twice before they click on a link, all of these things have to occur.
Casey.
Yeah, I got tons of thoughts screaming through my mind right now on this. I think back to a early presentation that was the most effective I ever had was a CIO at the time that worked for me, got popped on a click, and I had this presentation that did a timeline for staff, and I went to all the staff meetings, and I had 7 controls, and well, let's be honest, 3 of them were human performance, the individual. And so the sell that I gave everybody over and over was, hey, I spend a lot of money on all these controls and all these things, but you as an individual weigh as much as all of those other 3 controls, besides the last one that worked, which was outbound firewall here, So I think it was a great way to kind of bring it home. And I think that's a way we got to find to help people, because that's the challenge I've seen also as we went to work from home, is the technical fluency of individuals to use some of the technologies, to be able to, think outside the box about how can I get to this, it's sadly in some cases a bit comical. In other cases it's like, well, we haven't done a good job of educating people and helping them understand how they can work and how they can get the things done they need to. So I think that's a big one. And I think managing that risk is going to be very interesting because that workforce is going to be that driver, especially as you stay in this type of environment. Those people are a key to your success. So I think that's going to be another area you got to really focus on. How do you train it and bring them up?
Yeah, that's good. So we talk a lot about training. We talk about technical solutions. One of the challenges that I've always experienced working with security organizations is that security tends to be on the wrong side of the ledger, right? It's a cost. How have you, and all of the roles you've played, how do you convince the C-suite, the CFO, the CEO, the folks that are controlling the money, how do you convince them that this kinds of things you're talking about from a security perspective are not just a cost, rather they're an investment in resilience, preparation, et cetera? I mean, I would argue even in many cases now, it could be considered a differentiator and a revenue driver from a cyber health and security perspective. I want to put that to all of you because you all sit in different places and see different things. How do you convince the folks with the money that might not be as connected to these things that these are worthwhile investments? And then what are the right things to invest in sometimes? I mean, what are some of the best practices? So let's start with the first. How do you convince them it's worthwhile? Skeet, I'll start with you.
Well, I think the most important thing is to stick to a risk management protocol. You've got to identify what you're actually protecting and what the most important thing to your organization is. What are those assets that need the most protection? And then understand what the threats are to that so that you can actually somewhat quantify, which I know the quantification of the risk is a very difficult question in a lot of cases, but quantifying to the executives why these are the important projects, and then prioritizing based on the threats that focus on those critical aspects. If you can get the projects prioritized and go to the well and ask for the money to protect a critical asset and say, this is why we need it, I've generally found executives to be fairly reasonable. If you're going in and asking just in general because you need a tool, it becomes a very tough conversation.
Casey, to you.
I think having a broader strategy that ties into what they understand, right? The finances and the business operation helps dramatically to sell and understand, to clarify to them what risk mitigation they're getting from that investment. And I think that really helps drive the motor of security in the environment. And I'm blessed. I'm in a great environment. I got board support. I got all kinds of things. It's a great environment. But I think if you don't have that, I think you still got to find a way to become that business lead and help sell it in terms that they understand. And that's key.
That's great. Caitlin.
I'll pick up where KC was headed. I think that in addition to helping them understand the risk, it's the consequences if that vulnerability is exploited and what it means in business terms. And when you can put it in business terms and you can speak the language of the executive and help them understand that the consequences could be a loss of service, which means a loss of revenue or a loss of orders. But I think in some ways, even more importantly, the impact to brand and reputation, that gets people's attention. And so the last thing that you want is a disruption that makes the news and then goes viral. It's a lot harder to address that than to kind of mitigate the impacts of a disruption. And so again, the degree that you can explain it in terms of a business speak of what it means from a financial standpoint, but potentially reputational, I think you get their attention.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I'm hearing from all three of you, and I think I'm stealing the phrase from you, Casey, but I'll take credit for it publicly, is you can't just have a seat at the table. The security voice needs to have a voice at that table. And what I'm hearing from you guys as well is that voice needs to be listened to, not just heard. But like we all know, communication is a two-way street, right? I have to know what you want to hear and how you like to hear it and what language is relevant to you. And I think one of the important things that we've been learning is that the security professional needs to understand the business, right? Needs to know how to communicate with that CEO and that CFO. But on the flip side, that CFO and CEO, whoever that might be, needs to listen and also try to understand this is not just about a cost. This is not just about checking the box. Because when we talk about a remote environment, as we highlighted at the beginning, if we're moving to a remote environment, now we're mixing cyber and physical risk. A human operating system becomes not only a risk, but a potential for some bad things to happen, right? So go ahead, Steve, you comment there?
I was going to add that I think the timing of building that voice is important as well. You don't want to build it at the point of the incident. You don't want to be the first responder to the crisis every time. You need to be building that business voice along the path so that you become their trusted advisor. You become the person that they turn to when risk becomes an issue, and they are listening to you in those terms, but along the path as opposed to at the end where there's a crisis.
Okay. Casey, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to throw a thought in there. That being able to articulate to them why you're changing or what you're needing. I mean, I'll use myself as an example. With this, I'm putting in things, securing my internal networks and all these things, and have all these segmentation plans and all this other stuff that we've been doing the last few years. And now it's like, okay, that's not going to really help me as much. I got to refocus to, controls on data governance, DLP, and stop trying to prove the negative, right?
Yeah. I like that point about stop trying to prove the negative, right? That's a very difficult thing for any security organization, is to prove, these things didn't happen because I did something or I took an action. I think you're right. You need to move away from that. What can you use and what data can you show? I kind of want to put a little bit of our Toffler Associates future hat on each of you. What do you see as the great acceleration in this security world? And we talked a lot about COVID-19 and the pandemic forced a lot of companies to very quickly adopt a digital strategy, a remote workforce strategy. They might have said, well, I'm thinking about it, but I'm not quite there yet. And COVID-19 gave them that push. We'll see if that sustains. But as you look past the acute response and the great wait, when you see that novel normal, what do you see as some real enhancements to security that are going to sustain us in that period? What are some things that are going to accelerate during this period that might not have gotten the push that they would have gotten without COVID-19? Skeet, I'll start with you. Where do you see that acceleration headed?
So I think the move will be to protecting a better definition of what you're protecting and a move to protecting that asset wherever it resides. I traditionally security has been focused on almost out of an infrastructure type of view of the world. We build firewalls, we build SIMs, we build all of these tools that really are, I would call it network centric type of philosophy. And I think from my perspective, people are starting to recognize that really the protection is around the asset itself. It's around that digital asset, that data asset. So I think, as Casey mentioned a minute ago, data leak or data loss prevention tools, the DLP tool suites where you can actually better classify your data, understand how it's flowing through your organization. I think those areas are going to get significant bump coming out the backside of this.
Okay. Casey.
Yeah, I think it's going to be around decentralization, right? We've so many years put all this effort into the central log and controlling the network and limiting access, and it's just going to go out. And, so the remote technical capabilities to support that, I think, are going to be really difficult to get, that endpoint visibility, to be able to control that data flow, how people are using technology. I mean, you got to have better endpoint technical capabilities and visibility to still do security. But how are you getting that now? Because they can completely bypass every control you got by just going to the cloud service that is outside of your network, right? So how are you going to be able to still understand what's happening there? And it's going to really push back down to the endpoint or from whatever device or tool they're using to access the information. And it's really got to push back down there, or else you're not going to have it.
Yeah. Caitlin, what do you see as the acceleration?
I think it's the convergence of physical, cyber, and biodigital. I believe that we are going to need to get to a place where a lot of what we have traditionally done that requires contact, and I'm going to talk both physical and cybersecurity, but when you think about as you pass through turnstiles and you swipe your badge and you open doors and you put your CAT card in the computer, and we have to kind of reimagine a contactless security environment of what we call kind of frictionless security. And I think included in that now is also going to be health, right? And how you leverage, the data that comes off your wearables, maybe implantables down the road. And as we pass through, when we do return to work, and I do think that it's going to be a reduced footprint and not everybody will be in an office full time, but that you're going to pass through those doors and you'll be able to seamlessly get into the elevator and go to your workstation because biometrics are in place and we're leveraging the data that's being transmitted from your cell phone and your wearable. Now, this is going to, create enormous friction with privacy. And I think we're going to have a debate over the next 6 to 30 months about health versus privacy. But we've been talking about frictionless security for a long time, and I think this will accelerate it.
Okay. So one more, and then I want to turn to some of the Q&As that are coming in. Caitlin, you talked about this issue of, you said the pace is grueling, right? And we all realize that the thought before we went to a remote workforce at least 5 years ago tended to be this idea of, wow, you're working from home, it's nice and easy, it's relaxing. What we're really finding, or most people that are new to this are finding, no, it's actually a much more grueling day because you're always on.
Yep.
Right? It's not that people get up and walk down the hallway, or maybe they send an email. And now you're zooming into meetings, and you have to be available, and the office doesn't go away. I just want to talk to each of the panelists. Talk to me a little bit about that pace. Like, how do we as humans adjust to that pace and deal with that pace? And specifically, I also want you to touch on, if you can, in a remote workforce, how do you keep that sort of elan and spirit of your company and your organization together, as opposed to having 15 different nodes that are out there, really thinking about it as one cohesive unit? And I'll start with you, Casey. Talk about the grueling pace, and then how do you keep the team energized and together?
I know we're a social group, right? And we love to get together and talk and have meetings and see facial expressions. But an interesting thing I've noted through this is IT, cybersecurity. We do a lot through chat. We do a lot through tasking. We do a lot where you don't have to have that human person day-to-day interaction on a call. And what I've seen is throughout the business, I see other areas of the business really struggling to work from home. And I think people need to start doing work like they did when they were in the office and start thinking about, how do I do it differently where I can have more conversations, more capability, but not always have to be on at a screen, So I'd say for myself, I think pushing people to more, tasking, tools, being able to assign work, see that it got done and followed up on without having to have a status meeting. I actually sent out a long email to my entire team on like 5 things and said, all of this condensed in the office to email now. And I can't step away without getting 80 more in an hour. So we got to do something different. And I think that's where people got to shift that mindset and think about, what am I getting together for and what's the value in it? And I think it should focus to the decision making, the collaboration, and less about assigning and doing, and let people be more free in how they do and how they get it done.
So Casey, clearly you're around my age group, because you're sending emails and not like TikTok videos or something that's
yeah, no, I got no videos, man.
So Skeet, let me put that question to you. I mean, again, how do you deal with the potential burnout, and how do you keep that team as a cohesive unit as you move forward?
So I do think that there's 2 aspects that I would address. One is the collaborative side. How do you actually collaborate with your team? So the use of tools like Slack or Teams or Skype or whatever the choice of tool may be, but allowing that more consistent communication as opposed to a meeting, and more real time as opposed to an email, I think makes for a more fluid type of engagement. I think it's also the other side, which is there's a change in kind of the trust model of your employees. You kind of hit it there, Casey, on the tasking. Once that task is handed off, there's got to be a level of trust that that's going to be executed upon and then managed appropriately, if not, as opposed to we've got to get everyone onto a meeting, we've got to sit down and break it down and do it. You've got to be able to really be more effective of a delegator in a leadership role and divide that work out and get it to people that you can trust to execute on it.
Good. Caitlin.
I think the collaborative environments, and at Toffler we use Teams, are helpful on this. I think it helps cut down on emails. It helps, that's not a product endorsement, by the way, but it helps with collaboration, with the sharing of documents. And I want to kind of pull the string on Casey's point. Not everything has to be done by Zoom or WebEx or whatever your video conference platform is, and making that conscious decision. Can we resolve this through chat? Does it need a meeting? And if it needs a meeting, does that meeting have to be video, or can you just use a regular phone conference, right? So people can get outside and walk around and get some vitamin D and a change of pace. We've also done some interesting things at Toffler. for example, from 12 to 1 is a meeting-free hour, which means that at least internally, you're not allowed to schedule a meeting from 12 to 1. If you've got a client meeting, that's obviously another, another issue. We try to keep 30-minute meetings to 25 minutes so people have an opportunity to get up, walk around, take a bio break, get some coffee, whatever, and our hour-long meetings are supposed to end after 50 minutes. I think we've done a really good job of also creating the water cooler environment. So we'll throw a virtual coffee on the calendar, but there's no agenda, right? We're not, and people can join, they don't have to join, it's not mandatory. And it's just an opportunity to, sit down and chat and talk about, can't talk about sports right now, the weather, not the news. The news isn't exactly exciting. Maybe the weather, something your kids, the latest Zoom bomb.
Yeah.
So, there are a lot of creative ways. And I think, again, this is an opportunity to follow what's out there, and a lot is being written, and see what works for your organization. But you got to give people a break, and you can't have an expectation that they're on a Zoom from 8 to 5. It's just not realistic.
I think I want to summarize because I want to move to the Q&A because we've got some activity there. But it's important again to remember we talk about it as the novel normal in terms of that. I think you're all highlighting the fact that things aren't going to be the same, right? It's not that we just stop the game at the bottom of the 5th with 2 on and 2 out and we'll pick it up when the rain stops, right? There will be a lot of changes, and we're going to need to give people the space to understand what those changes are. And back to some points Skeet and KC made about, yes, it's about people, but how are we educating not just the workforce, but also the broader business perspective? And so I want to turn to a couple of questions, and thank you for the activity on the Q&A. I'll warn the panelists, we have a few technical questions and a few broader questions. So I'm going to try and put on my technical hat as much as I can. Our first question is, has the value proposition for a business changed in the new normal, and does that change the security landscape? Has the definition of criticality changed? Skeet, I'll give you that one first.
I think the short answer is yes. The value proposition absolutely changes, but I think the challenge we're going to run into as we move forward from a security landscape perspective is the vulnerabilities, the hygiene, the basic activities that we are supposed to be doing on a day-to-day basis, they haven't changed. A lot of those processes are exactly the same as they were when we were in our normal environment. However, the way we execute them has. So we still need to protect the business in the same manner. We still have the same responsibility and due care to protect the assets under our protection. So we may need to look at how we structure our architectures, how we actually define our policies, how we actually train our teams to make sure that we're realizing the value proposition of security in that space. But I think the fundamental process of security is still identify the risks, build the programs that are effective at identifying, mitigating, and monitoring those threats as they come in.
Right. So again, your point though about building the programs that are effective, you talked about it earlier, it's defining what some of those measures are to highlight that effectiveness as opposed to simply saying, well, nothing happened, right? That we talked with Casey about proving the negative. Casey, anything to add on that? Otherwise, I'll turn to question 2.
I'll just throw a quick comment that, I'm a technologist at heart, but I think getting that, focus around how do you manage your environment as we're in this new norm, when I see a lot of questions coming up here around cloud and managing my risk and my vendors and all these kind of things. There was a great statement a long time ago a gentleman made, and I can't claim it, but identity being the new boundary, right? When we started going into identity management. And at this point, I don't think you can think of anything being contained in any one location. And the controls have to be, that's what I was talking about earlier. I maybe didn't articulate it well, but those technical controls because, you know, you can have policy, which is great. It tells somebody you shouldn't do something, but you're going to have to start finding ways and implementing technical controls to stop people from doing those things. Because no matter how great you train people or how great your staff is, let's be honest, I don't trust most folks. So I want a technical control that's going to limit what they can do and make sure that things are operating within those policies, right?
Sorry, Casey. I'm so sorry you don't trust most folks. It's a dark world, okay. You guys. I do a lot of work with counterintelligence folks, and I always remind them it's a dark world they live in. It's just a sad, dark place where they don't trust a lot of people.
It's trust but verify, right?
Trust. Thank you, Ronald Reagan. Well
Healthy
played.
paranoia.
Okay. That's
exactly.
Casey, you're showing your age at this point. You're showing your age. All right. Question 2. I'm not ignoring you, Caitlin. I'm going to get there, but I want to.
It's fine. Should not be directed to me.
To Skeet and Casey again. The question is, can you expand more on risks to the cloud that many organizations are relying on today? What should you be expecting from your cloud or SaaS provider versus needing to take on yourself? So let's start with KC this time, and I'll go to Skeet. KC, what do you got?
Yeah, well, I think you got to be realistic, right? As you're putting together all those contracts and everything else, you offload certain things like expectations of those vendors, but ultimately, let's be honest, I tell my team all the time, nobody cares more than our company name, right? Because those individuals have an invested interest in what we do and how we do it. And no matter how much I'm paying this other service provider, whatever, the day I stop paying, they don't care, right? So I have to be thinking about, how do I protect myself, leveraging the capability that I'm using or the technology I'm using from them, but do it in a way that's a proactive protection and not just, oh, I have some contract language, because that's great, but that's all after the fact, right? So, you know, those are great if you're a lawyer and you want to protect your organization from risk and litigation, all those things, that's required. But I think protecting your stuff by teaching individuals that, hey, we have a data classification policy. Hey, telling your technical teams to make sure that they've implemented those controls, like tagging every single thing made in O365 as sensitive by default and putting certain limitations around it, and then allowing staff to move it up to confidential to protect it even more, or move it down to public and letting it go where you want. So I think those kind of things is where you really got to start to think differently, because, you know, everybody's in the old mindset yet. You know, it's kind of like when the data center started to go to cloud and everybody was like, well, I can't do that. I got to have my data center. And I think this is where, you know, you're going to see this shift, and it's going to be an accelerated shift.
Okay. Skeet.
So I think I start at the vendor risk assessment. What vendors do you have? What are you putting out there? And then what are the controls necessary around it to ensure the protection of that data? Anything from who owns the keys? Is it a multi-tenant environment? If the multi-tenant environment, can their employees see across tenants? Mm-hmm. You know, there's a lot of things that need to be thought through when you're doing the risk assessment of that vendor, and assuming that they're doing things usually doesn't end up with a good outcome. You need to assess those risks and develop plans for how you're going to mitigate those risks as you're deploying that cloud tool. And I think that's one of the challenges that we've seen out there with clients is they will move to the cloud and make those assumptions that certain things are being done and not develop a cohesive plan to execute against that in the cloud in the way that they would if it were an internal application that they're deploying.
Right. Okay. We have time for a couple more questions, so I appreciate everyone's activity out there in cyberspace. Let me open this up really to anyone. Caitlin, now you're back in the game, right? This is a question that we talked about a little bit earlier, where again, those poor roommates keep getting the brunt of our ire at this point. But have you considered liabilities and licensing issues that may occur with remote workers? For example, electrical capacity, privacy from family and friends, printouts, shoulder surfers, etc., insurance for slip and fall, or repetitive stress disorder syndrome. Caitlin, why don't we start with you on that one?
I think that's a great question, right? And we talk about kind of the concentric circles of security, right? From the perimeter of the building and the network into the home. Well, you've got concentric circles of liability. And these are issues that legal and human capital are going to have to start to deal with. If you're going to permanently move to remote work and this becomes, my office space, what am I responsible for versus what is my employer responsible for? So I don't know that we have an answer right now, but these are all questions that are legitimately on the table, and some of them are easier than others. To come full circle to the conversation that we were having about the human operating system, and one of the biggest challenges is that humans really are your biggest vulnerability, and at a house you may try and put all of these controls in place to limit Zoom bombs and shoulder surfing, and I can't read the list of things, but people make mistakes, and whether intentional or unintentional, and how much responsibility does someone at home bear for that? Before every Zoom I tell my kids I'm on a Zoom from 12 to 1, like, keep it quiet and do not come in my office. And that, short of putting a padlock on my office door and soundproofing it, these are going to be questions that we've got to sort through. And I hope we take a reasonable approach to it, really.
I think it's interesting, and I want to make sure we move on to the other questions, but one of the things to highlight is, this is one of the reasons we do the Imagine If exercise here at Top Floor Associates, so you can take that cross-functional and multidisciplinary approach, as Caitlin's talking about, because we can look and say, one of the issues I wonder about personally is, as we move to a remote workforce, what will be the implications for the tax base in states and municipalities as people can choose to work outside the state or city where the company is located, right? What does that mean for real estate, for taxes, for traffic, for all of these things? Right now, we're thinking about it from a cybersecurity perspective, but you guys can pull different threads and see how that's going to impact not only your security footprint, but your GSOC. Where do you have to look? What are you concerned about overall? So that's I always come back to, probably because I have no technical cybersecurity knowledge. I come back to what I know, which is sort of that interdisciplinary and cross-functional perspective. We got time for 2 more quick questions. It looks like Skeet's got a comment. I'm going to get it quickly. Skeet, go ahead.
Yeah. So one thing I would throw out there is even something as simple as, how do you conduct incident investigations? You're now crossing over and modifying your acceptable use policies and making sure that you've got the rights to be able to investigate within that environment.
Yeah.
I love my new corporate cafeteria and the food it serves, but but we've got to be able to investigate cyber incidents, and if it's in someone's home, that's a significantly complicating factor.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. I've got 2 what I hope are quick questions, and then I want to wrap it up. So I'm going to ask Skeet and Casey to make them quick questions. I have here, what new managed detection and response technology will emerge for more visibility? KC, what do you got?
I think it goes back to, you're going to have to find a new way to get that visibility between the endpoint and your critical information, whether it's in your data center, in the cloud, or whatever. So it's going to go back, it's going to push back out to the endpoint. You're going to have less central log visibility. You're going to have more agent control capabilities, and then you're going to have those integrated with your SOC capabilities, and if you're using managed service functions, getting it pumped over to them. And like I said, the one big change I saw is pumping out EDR, so that we could just black hole a device and say, okay, we want to do an incident response on that, send it in, we'll send you a new one, right?
Yeah.
And so then we don't have to deal with going to people's homes, this, that, the other, but we have that visibility, we have the capability, and we can do it all remote, and it doesn't have to be connected to our network to even do it.
All right, I'll kick last question to Skeet. Skeet, what's the best way for an organization to decide what IP needs to be on premises versus portable?
So I think this goes back to your data classification policy. I think you need to look at your data classification, understand those assets, because it could be intellectual property, it could be classified information, it could be any multitude of sensitive protected data, and where do you want that flowing? But I think the deployment of tools which help categorize, classify that data, and tag it appropriately are critical to us being successful. To Casey's point, it's not where it's sitting as much as knowing that you have the controls around it to protect it appropriately.
Okay. And I'm going to throw a bonus question out there just because I'm the moderator and I can do that. You know, when you talk about healthy paranoia, it seems that a lot of things are very important and relying on this idea of healthy paranoia. Casey doesn't trust anybody, trust but verify. Caitlin talks about healthy paranoia. Steven Spielberg seems a little bit more calm with folks, right? But you can monitor. What do you look for in a candidate, whether it's a security position or otherwise, to see whether they really have that healthy paranoia? How do you help candidates understand what you're looking for, or how do you judge for that in employees? And I'll go Skeet, Caitlin, Casey, and then we'll wrap up. Skeet, what would you suggest? What's the question you would ask?
I think I would ask the question around how they view themselves as part of the organization. Do they view themselves as a critical function of the organization so that they're there to protect that asset?
I like that. I like that. Caitlin.
That's a great question, Hans. I'd say
I'm gonna
two
pretend
things.
I came up with it myself.
And some people love this question and some people hate this question. I do think it's provides an interesting look into people's minds, but it's the kind of what keeps you up at night. And we've interviewed a lot of professionals over the course of Toffler time. And it is amazing the people who say the things that I'm not thinking about, right, or that I don't know, or that I'm going to be blindsided by. And I think that's a good look into people's minds. I think also their kind of understanding of the need to bring imagination to, frankly, any role, but certainly to security. We all know about the famous, 9/11 report and the failure of imagination. I would tell you the 2016 elections were a failure of imagination. But how they would see routinizing and bureaucratizing imagination into the security process.
Good. Casey, 30 seconds. What do you got?
My answer, it depends. I think the answer depends on if you're asking a question around somebody who's a risk manager versus a technologist. I'll never forget, I had a boss one time that informed me I wasn't paranoid enough. However, the challenge was he was like freaking out about everything. And if he understood the risk and concerns that I had about what I technically knew about our environment versus what he perceived. And I think pulling those questions out of individuals that are more behavioral and asking them a question that boxes it in a way that says, like an example question that I love is, give me an example of a time you had so much going on, you're afraid you drop something. The way they respond to that question, coaxing it in that way gives you so much insight to, if it's always we or he or she or they or me, how they're looking at responding to that. So I think asking the question in that way to really coax out what they're thinking.
Good. Well, I'm going to try to keep us on time. I want to thank everyone for joining us today for this moderated panel. I had to say moderated because that's what I do, so I want to say moderated. But Skeet, Caitlin, Casey, thank you for taking the time. To all of you out there, thank you for joining us, and thank you for asking your questions before the event as well as during. I want to put out two specific offers for everyone out there. The first is from Toffler Associates, and I have to open up my note here because it was given to me late. We are putting out there a 45-minute consultation regarding how to bring a cross-functional approach to security in the novel normal to identify those blind spots that Caitlin was talking about and build processes for resilient-based decision-making. So please reach out to us if you'd like to schedule one of those. And what from Skeet at Pillar is offering is office hours with the CISO every Tuesday and Wednesday from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern. Again, thank you everybody for your time. I really appreciate it. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. Stay safe and stay sane out there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.